Hello and welcome to another video. I'm Megan of Missy Magley Cosplay, and today I'd love it if you joined me as well as one of my favorite people ever, Poison Ivy. Anyone who knows me knows that I am more than a little obsessed with Poison Ivy. She is, in my opinion, the most iconic character to ever grace the pages of any comic book. Not to mention, her brand of femininity and sensuality is like catnip to me, and I happen to agree with how she lives her life. After all, is trying to protect the environment truly villainy? I think not. Also, I think we need to do more to celebrate women in STEM, and for Dr. Eiley, that's both an appropriate acronym and literally the truth. I very much enjoy making my own Poison Ivy designs. Part of this is the freedom to create. At the heart of any Ivy design will be red hair and some form of green leafy motif, but other than that, there's a lot of freedom to create. Additionally, Ivy is often depicted wearing a corset, and you need only take the most cursory glance at my videos to know that corsetry is something I very much enjoy. Over the years, I have done many versions of Poison Ivy. In fact, at this time last year, I was making another Poison Ivy, which you can check out somewhere up here. So if you'd like to learn how to make your own Poison Ivy, or like me, you simply love the character, this is the video for you. Now without any further ado, let's get into it.
First things first, for the mother of plants you're going to need some greenery. Before even beginning construction, I sourced myself some artificial leaves and flowers. As you can see, I bought a lot, but that was a good thing as I used all of it save for the few leaves I kept in reserve for any necessary repairs. I even broke down and used an old headpiece from years ago I'd never once worn. Waste not, want not. To prepare the leaves for use, I separated out individual segments from the assorted greenery. This was tedious but not unpleasant and allowed me a greater freedom to put them wherever I so chose. I started construction with the base for the half cape, which is made of leftover zebra scraps molded to the shape of my shoulders. It wasn't beautiful, but it did make a sturdy base to lay down the long vines in order to form the actual cape element of this piece. Once these were all affixed, I started adding flowers and leaves along the shoulders to create volume and texture. I used as many different pieces as I could, as I find that the greater the diversity of the material, the more complex and beautiful the result. Sort of like life, really. I used the same process to make the flower crown. As usual, I began with a headband base and simply glued flowers and leaves to it. This time, however, I made it as symmetrical as possible, which I had also done with the cape. Often I eschew symmetry, but this time I thought it'd look cool. Oh, and I also made some shoes, but you won't see those until an upcoming vlog. Corset time! I began with this dark green cotton, which is actually a thrifted bedsheet. Not only is thrifting a cheap source of fabric, it's also more environmentally friendly, so I use thrifted fabrics wherever possible. After giving it a good wash, I laid out my pattern pieces atop it and began to cut. This pattern is the bunnysuit pattern from Aranea Black, who sadly is no longer making corset patterns, so I treasure the ones I have from her. Because the fabric is relatively dark, I had to trace each piece with chalk before cutting it out. Out of this cotton, I first cut 2 of each piece save the lower center back, of which I only cut 1, and the elastic insert, for which I used a different fabric. Which fabric, you might ask? This is a scrap of black two-way stretch left over from my data jumpsuit, to which I actually had to pin the pattern piece in order to make sure I could cut it accurately. I opted to cut 3 layers of this fabric for extra thickness in order to avoid wardrobe malfunctions, and top stitch them together as a method of flatlining. Here, I used my trick for sewing along a grain that stretches. Since I don't use elastic thread, I instead sew these seams under tension, so that when the fabric stretches, the stitches don't snap. The result is slightly wavy when relaxed, but when it's stretched, it looks the same. Not the most elegant, but effective. Here you can see all the pieces assembled thus far. Yes, they were wrinkled at this point, but not to fret, they all got a good press later. I knew I wanted to flatline, but first I seamed together the 2 front pieces. This I did as opposed to cutting 1 piece over the fold, as I thought at first I might use a busk, which would necessitate an opening. At this point, I had decided the busk was unnecessary, and so I joined them together to create a single piece that I could flatline, also stitching down the seam allowance to smooth everything nicely. Flatlining I did via my standard method. I first laid all the pieces atop my desired lining fabric, in this case the same fabric as I had decided to self-line each piece. This I did in order to create 2 layers between which I could sandwich the boning. Then I cut everything out, leaving a bit of extra room around each seam allowance. After this, I top stitched the layers together within the seam allowance, leaving the top and bottom edges open to facilitate slipping in the bones when it was time. The final lining step was to cut away the excess fabric and ta-da! Here are my flat-lined pieces, ready for assembly. Time for my favorite part, seaming everything together. There's no right order in which to do this, so I usually like to vary it, just for interest. I always work symmetrically, however. I started by seaming the two side front pieces together, each on left and right. For this, as for all these seams, I used a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, always right sides together. Then I joined the side center pieces together with the seam that runs directly under the armpit. This is the most curved seam, but Araneo Black always walks her seams properly, so the curves fit perfectly and did not need ease. After that, I attached each back side piece to the joined center side pieces. Next, I could pin and seam each pair of front side pieces to the center front piece, and then the previously joined pieces to either side of that. You might notice I left out the center back pieces. This I did purposely as I wanted to bind the raw edge before connecting it to the rest of the costume. In order to accomplish this, I simply laid a strip of fabric right sides with the center back along that center back seam and stitched. Then I trimmed away the excess and folded the strip over that trimmed seam, pinning it wrong sides together. In stitching it all down a 1/2 inch from the center back, I also created what is arguably the most important of all the boning channels in any corset. Then I could attach these bound pieces to the rest of the corset. Assembly was almost complete, but not before I attached the stretch insert to the lower center back piece. I also joined the other edge of the stretch insert to the center front and the outer edge of the lower center to the center back pieces, making sure everything was mirrored. To finish the seams, I clipped, then pressed them. I cannot emphasize enough how important this step is to make sure your seams both look nice and sit flat and smooth against your body. It's also very fun and satisfying. Next, I put in my boning in 2 stages. I started by creating 1/2 inch boning channels at the back in order to distribute the strain of the lacing. Doing boning channels by machine is just a matter of marking and top stitching, and it's something I always enjoy. As this corset would not benefit from the support afforded by a metal busk, I also made sure to put several bones at the center front to create the necessary stiffness. Speaking of bones, I like to use zip ties. In this case, I used these large ones, which I pressed flat using my iron before trimming and slipping into the channels I had just made. Then I could mark out the placement of my grommets. Keep in mind that the greater the number of grommets, the less strain each one will take with lacing, which is crucial when there is going to be a lot of pressure on the garment. Given the fact that this corset doesn't give me a huge waist reduction, I didn't need too many here. As always, I used my tool and die to set them in individually. This is a quick process and I always find it fun, probably because it involves a mallet and an anvil. Ever wondered what this sounds like? Please enjoy some ASMR on me. Now here are the finished grommets. Aren't they pretty? I think so, and I'm totally not weird about it. Time to finish the rest of the boning channels. As I usually use my seams as a guide for placement, I had to finish those first. In order to do this, I folded the seam allowances away from the center front and stitched them down with a 1/4 inch width. This creates a strong seam as it effectively doubles the amount of stitching at each seam, and for a corset, strong seams are a must. With this done, I could mark out 1/2 inch boning channels and top stitch them in place. For the center side seams, which would take the most strain, I paired my boning channels on either side of each seam. For the rest, I simply did a single channel on the side closest to the center front. This actually isn't a lot of boning, again because I wasn't giving myself a waist reduction, but also because I knew just how much stiffness the decoration would add, making any more boning largely redundant. After putting in the bones, I did nothing more to finish the raw edges than top stitch along the top and bottom edges. Somewhere there was a sewist screaming at my impudence for doing this. Let them scream, I say. Before I could decorate, the last step was to lace everything up. My standard pattern for lacing is crisscross with loops at the center. This allows me to tighten the corset by pulling on the loops, which I can then double knot to keep secure. As much as I adore the 18th century, I will confess that this sort of lacing is much easier than the 18th century's habit of spiral lacing. And now the simplest part of the corset, gluing on the leaves. I find it amusing that the easiest step is the one that people tend to find the most impressive, especially as what it covers is all the careful engineering and fitting that goes into actually making the corset. In order to create my desired effect, I first laid down some fluffier fronds at the hips, which serve the dual purpose of creating an hourglass silhouette, as well as covering my lower hips, a part of my body of which I am self-conscious. Then I simply layered the leaves across the body of the corset, angling them away from the waistline, either up for the top or down for the bottom. After the first layer, I then began hiding the base of each leaf under the tip of another as I glued them. Again, I used a variety of leaf types, colors, and sizes, which created an attractive complexity and a pleasing texture. And yes, I am using hot glue for all of this. While E6000 works very well for this sort of thing, in this case hot glue was an equally effective, much cheaper, and far less odoriferous alternative, and so hot glue it was. And with that, Ivy was ready to venture out to admire her green and growing children, all enjoying a lovely summer day.
And that's it! Thank you so much for joining me today. As always, liking or commenting on this video or subscribing to my channel is very much appreciated, but regardless, I'm just happy you're here. If you'd like to see my other shenanigans, both in the world of cosplay and historical work, feel free to check out my other videos and to follow me on socials. All that information will be down in the description box. But until we meet again, take care, and I'll see you next time.